So welcome everyone to tonight's presentation on Faith and Memoirs. Warren Murphy, as some of you are aware, has 2 new books that have just been published on his journey as a priest in Wyoming. And we hope that some of you might want to purchase the book following his presentation if you are so inspired. The proceeds from the book get split between Thomas the Apostle Center and
That was the last book.
Oh, sorry. That was the last book. Welcome, everyone who's with us on Facebook tonight. And welcome those of you who are here, gathered in the church. And I will let Warren talk about where the proceeds go. Perhaps it's to feed a poor man in his retirement. Who knows? We know it will be for some good cause. We're glad you're all here tonight. This introduction comes with a little bit of an apology for those of you who have been here since 5:30, waiting for some music. Jane Bell had hoped she'd be with us in October, and then it turns out she has to work every Thursday in October, so she could not join us for a set, and I had importuned, I guess, my daughter to come up and play some more saxophone and jazz for us, but she is marching in the marching band tonight from 6 to 9, and she had homework that she had to do and was unable to join us for a set this evening. So I hope you have found this place restful and meditative in its quiet. We're glad you're all here, and I'm very pleased to introduce someone to you who probably needs no introduction, since he is the former rector of this very church, the Reverend Warren Murphy, and we're so happy to have you here. I'm so excited that you have 2 new books that I know you've been working on for some time, and we are looking forward to hearing from those books. Thanks, Warren. Welcome.
Well, greetings to you all. First of all, it's 2 books, but it's really one. That's a little confusing. It's a 2-volume set of a memoir of my 43 years having served as a clergy in the state of Wyoming. And it's a privilege to be able to speak to you tonight in this so-called picnic. I'm not seeing a lot of picnics around. But you can't eat in the church tonight, by the way. It's permissible. Proceeds go to me. There's a number of costs we still have to do to reimburse all this, but it all works out, as you know, because when people tithe, their income all comes back to God. So that's the way I do my giving these food. We'll wait till everybody gets settled here. First of all, as Mary said, I think I know most of you, maybe not a couple, but Warren Murphy and I have been in this diocese of Wyoming for that 43-year period beginning in 1977. And it's been a wonderful journey. And what I decided, I wrote a book several years ago, and some of you have seen it, and many of you have seen it, called On Sacred Ground, which is the religious and spiritual history of Wyoming. And that's a history book. And it's the only one of its kind that's ever been written dealing with faith and spirituality and religion and how it affected the state or did not affect the state. And that book's done very well, but this is a little bit different. It's a 2-part memoir, and it's called Unique and Different. And it has 2 wonderful, colorful photos on here. The first one is volume 1. And this covers my time from coming here to the town of Dixon. Y'all know where Dixon is? There are a few nods. Anybody that's never been to Dixon?
Never been or have
Never been to Dixon.
I've never been to Dixon.
All these folks have been to Dixon. That's amazing. Anyway, it starts with
I guess I'm the outlier.
It goes through the years that we spent in Lander, working on both Trinity Church in Lander and the Wyoming, the Wind River Indian Reservation, where I spent 5 years. And then it takes you up to coming to Cody. And there's some wonderful, humorous, and colorful stories in here about that. This picture, by the way, is a scene from a very famous site in the state called aspen owl. And it's up above Savory on the way to Encampment. A lot of people have never seen it, but if you ever get the chance, go to see this. It's just a gorgeous place, especially about now, the 1st of October, when all those aspen, it's all aspen country, and it all turns gold. And so that's a classic picture there. And then the second volume will be from Cody on, being rector here at Christ Church for 15 years. And then doing a number of other things, running the Wyoming Association of Churches as director for a number of years, and an organization I've been involved with since I got to the state. I've been with that group, which is our ecumenical and interfaith group. It's now known as WIN, Wyoming Interfaith Network. And I've been with that group for all 43 years in one way or another. This picture is just to sort of symbolize going into the future. And it's a wonderful photo I came across done by Rowan Weems, and she granted me the permission to use this on the cover of the book. Some of you may know Rowan. She's a good photographer and artist in Powell. So what I think we're going to do is, and I'm sorry we don't have the music. I can't do solos unless somebody else wants to. You don't have to. Don't do it. We do something. That's good. But so we'll just have to do without the prelude. So what I'll do is just jump right in and read a couple of stories. How long do we have? Okay, that's good. And also, at some point, if you've got any questions you want to ask, just raise your hand. I'd be glad to share some ideas. These are stories that deal with what I think are important ideas and deal with some wisdom and insight about not only the state, but about the nature of the church, the Episcopal Church, church at large. It was designed to be profound and humorous. People like humor, but the profundity is really what it's really all about, to somehow leave a message for people. And I hope it's a message of wisdom. So all these stories, I can break them down, but they have to do with learning something and then conveying wisdom. I'll start by saying that when we came here, Kate, this is my wife Kate, for those who don't know Kate, and son Malcolm, I'm sorry, son number 2. Malcolm actually is the one who did all the designing and work on publishing this whole series here. It's, I think, a great production. And he's got his own little operation now called Sundance Media. And so he did all this, and it took a while, but we got it done, and I think it's a well-done job. But Kate and I came to Dixon in 1977. And we came just because we'd been through the West a number of times and always thought maybe it'd be nice to move back here. And I had already done a number of years as an ordained priest living in a number of places, but mostly Buffalo, New York. That was my home diocese. And we came here actually from Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Kate was finishing nursing school. And we arrived as naive Easterners in the West. And what I do over this period of the memoir is to come in and sort of explain my naivety to begin with, but being fascinated by what I see after we came. And it's a story that both Kate and I and Malcolm and other son Aaron, they're all in this. But as the naivety is there to begin with, and I sort of tell these naive stories of my own, but learning about how the West works. So that as time goes on, I get smarter and smarter and smarter. And by the time I've got to tonight, I'm a pretty wise person. All because I've lived this and I wanted to share that story. Let me begin with this story. This is one of a little bit about my family. I came first a few months before Kate did because we were married after I was here 6 months. I went back, we had a marriage service in Niagara Falls, New York. And then we both moved out here. But I came early because I really wanted to get into this. By the way, the reason I came to Wyoming was I came out here the summer before, 1976. Just looked around with consent from my bishop to look for a position that was, quote, unique and different. I wanted something that wasn't the standard, That wasn't what a lot of clergy were looking for, someplace to start out and then rise up to be bishop someday or something like that. No, what I wanted was something unique and different. I'd always worked in ministry that way, in seminary and otherwise. And so I was looking for something that met that standard. And when I got to Wyoming, the bishop at the time was Thornberry, I know Connie knows quite well. David Thornberry was just fascinating. And he offered me, he said, I've got a church. It's in the southern part of the state. It's been closed for 2 years. Nobody will go there. I said, whoa, that sounds like a place for me. A Little Snake River Parish, that was the name of it. And he said, as I'll point out in here in the book, he said, well, it says it's a nice little place. I think it even has some trees. And actually, it did have two big silver maples around the rectory. So we said, yeah, that sounded great. We came out here, we interviewed, we had a great experience. I tell about that. But then when I came out in February of 1977, I came on my own. And I arrived in Dixon's neighboring town, which is called Baggs. I mean, you've all been at least through Baggs. Most people go through and keep on going, but you know, that's Baggs. It's not a tourist attraction. It's a pretty rough place, actually, but it was a wonderful ranching community, known for its big ranches, and they do it the old-fashioned way, old-time ranching, which I explain throughout the book. So I'm going to read this little story, a very short little thing about my first Sunday when I got there, doing the first service at Little Snake River Parish. So, as we began the service on Sunday morning, I was pleased to see a good number of people arriving for the morning service. I was also a bit surprised that there didn't appear to be an effort to have a coffee hour or a reception following the event. This would have been a time to get to know the congregation personally. The service proceeded along quite well. I preached a sermon that optimistically looked forward to our time ahead as a renewed congregation. Remember, they'd been closed for 2 years. As is customary, I greeted people at the door after the service's conclusion. Folks were very polite. Many said they were pleased to have me there. Then all of them got into their cars and drove away. I thought to myself, this is going to be a long week, and a lonely one at that. The last man out of the church was an older rancher named Gilbert Williams. He came to the church by himself that day. He was nicely dressed and wearing a cowboy hat that covered most of his face. As he passed me at the door, he shook my hand while staring down at his boots. Pleased to meet you, he said, and he moved on. But then he made my day. He slowly turned around and said, say, would you like to go to lunch? It was the timeliest invitation I have ever had. He drove me 7 miles into Baggs and proceeded to tell me about his ranch, his wife Eva, who remained home with his son Tom, who lived with him. He said Tom was about my age and he hoped I would shortly meet him. We arrived at Baggs' only eatery called the Drifter's Inn. This is a large facility that served as a bar, a restaurant, and a motel. There were a few cowboys playing poker with real money near the bar. And as we entered the restaurant, Gilbert noticed an old friend sitting by himself. There's old Mills Craig, he said. Let's go have lunch with him. It was then that I met a most unforgettable character. And I do have a picture of him here that you can look at afterwards, or you can get the book and see him. It's classic. Mills Craig was a tall, well-worn cowboy who had to be in his mid-80s. He was dressed all in black with a shiny leather vest and the biggest black cowboy hat I've ever seen. I also couldn't help but notice the large 6-gun strapped to his waist. He looked like the old Marshall Dillon from the famous Gunsmoke TV series. I think you're all old enough to remember. "Pleased to meet you," he said. Everybody down there, by the way, says, "Pleased to meet you." Great. At first I thought he must be the local attraction for the passing tourists. But there aren't any tourists in Bags. He could be the real deal. And as we munched on our hamburgers, he talked about his ranching life in Colorado in the Little Snake River Valley. He said his family held one of the oldest brands in Colorado, and that he had known many of the valley's early pioneers. A big rage in America during that time was the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, with Paul Newman and Robert Redford. I asked him if he knew much about the Butch Cassidy gang, who spent time hiding out in the Bags area. He replied he not only knew about the gang, but as a youth he knew several of the gang members personally. He then went on to mention them by name, saying, "Well, so-and-so is a son of a bitch, but that another so-and-so is a decent fellow." I listened to his first-hand stories about the Butch Cassidy days throughout our lunch. That night, I pondered the excitement of my first Sunday in my new home. I had finally arrived in Wyoming, and in less than a week, I met a man who personally knew the Butch Cassidy gang. As time went on, I discovered that Mills Craig was indeed the real deal, and that Gilbert Williams, the rancher, and his family would become soon some of my closest friends. And I can't see it very well from there, but this is a picture of old Mills Craig, and he looks to be real. Great to know to start off that journey. So we stayed in Bags. We were there for 5 years and had to rebuild that church and try to bring a faith presence back into the Little Snake River Valley. And a kid came along a little later, and she worked at the hospital in Craig, Colorado, commuted, and then became the public health nurse for the whole valley towards the end. And we also had a church in Bags, which we ended up closing after 2 years because they were only 7 miles apart. It didn't make sense to have 2 facilities. But we kept the building. It's called St. Luke's in Bags. And then when she got her job as public health nurse, I used it sort of as an office. And we called the place the Body and Soul Shop. Fit in very well in Bags. By the way, going back into Little Snake River was like a time warp. They had things like a 7-party party line for the phone service. It's called Du Bois Telephone. No, it became Du Bois Telephone. It's one step up from there now, but it was a 7-party party line then. And try to do church work on a 7-party party line. And it's not just that you had 7 parties, but everybody tunes in and listens to you when you get your call. It was the thing to do, because they didn't have any television. So I learned very quickly how to deal with some very strange circumstances. But we made it work. We got to know and spend time going to the homes of many of these people, and actually spending time going out with some of them on the job. I tell about many of those stories in here. Checking out a sheep camp in the desert, or herding up sheep who had been left behind in the desert, helping with the cattle roundups, brandings, everything else. So in a sense, I fulfilled this little naive mystery I had growing up about, quote, cowboys and Indians. I actually could be, in my own way, a cowboy, at least a little bit. I wouldn't want to do it for a living. But that was a wonderful experience. We left there after 5 years, and went then to Lander. And in Lander, it was a bit different. That's a sort of standard type parish, but they also had some problems when I got there. They were known for being a church that back in 1982, this would have been, that was still using the 1928 prayer book. And they were hiding it from the bishop, so he didn't know. The first thing the bishop told me when I got there is, they're hiding the 1928 prayer book, and I want it gone. They have to use the new book. And I found out that was only a small part of the congregation. Actually, the main part of the congregation was young, aggressive, dynamic, wanted to really see the church grow and be different. And the 2 kinds of groups there, they talked to each other, but they kept separate. And so I made a compromise with him, He said, you know, what we can do is we'll hold that 8 o'clock service, which is 20, 30 people at the time, and we'll do it with rite 1, which is very similar, as you know, in the prayer book, to the 1928 service. We'll do that. Oh, and they also wanted no children and no music. Okay, no children, no music. They can't keep the children out if they come. They're allowed to come, but no children did anyway. And then the 10 o'clock service, on the other hand, had to be totally whatever we could do. We wanted to try new, innovative things, be exciting, really lift things up. And we did that. And it was a good compromise. And over time, and that congregation over time grew to nearly 70, 80 people a service, combined with the 30 at the other service. So we were doing about 100 folks for a little congregation in Wyoming. And those of you who've been to Lander, you know, it's a beautiful town. It sits right at the base of the Wind River Mountains. And it has a very little wind. And it's just a nice place to be. And Aaron was born, my oldest son, Aaron, was born in Little Snake in Dixon. Malcolm was born in Lander. So now we had 2 children and bought our own house. It was sort of looking more like a standard Episcopal assignment. But they were really, one of the problems they had is they always had problems getting money. They could never seem to raise enough. It's puzzling because there were a lot of people there, but we had no big, quote, sugar daddies who were putting in money to the congregation. And so it was all tight all the time. Kate again got a job working in the local hospital as an OB nurse. And I was working on a pretty limited salary. And we decided that maybe I should do some other things to make a full salary. At which point the opportunity came along to be the visiting priest at the Shoshone Mission on the Wind River Indian Reservation. So there's the possibility of doing 2. And there was a 3rd church too, Atlantic City. That got thrown in with Lander. So I had Atlantic City, Lander, and then a couple of years in the Shoshone Mission. Tried doing all 3 on a Sunday. But while we were there, we did a number of things that were neat and exciting, and also being very involved with the Diocese of Wyoming. And this next story is it's sort of a funny one, I think. It's a profound one too. And you may know some of these people involved, but I was a member of the Commission on the Ministry of the Diocese. And we'd hold meetings all year long, usually in Laramie, which is a good ride for Lander. So here's this story. I continued my work on the Diocesan Commission on Ministry, known as the COM, which involved regular travel throughout the state. Travel in Wyoming is always an adventure, especially in winter. When it snows and blows, this means whiteouts on the road when another vehicle passes you and sends snow all over the place. Nothing but white. When being passed by a big truck, this means losing all sight for quite some time. When there were night drives where visibility because of snow is so bad, you have to depend on the reflecting delineators on the side of the road to know where the highway goes. I'm sure you've all experienced that one time or another. Anyway, diocesan meetings were held either in Casper or Laramie, and questionable roads made for sometimes perilous adventure. One particular trip provided for a memorable journey. It was also in winter, and the meeting was a 2-day affair held at St. Matthew's Cathedral. There were 2 other committee members living in Fremont County. Lynn Wright was a fellow priest, serving in the town of Du Bois. In addition to being the church's rector there, he was also known as the top-rate musician. He sang and played the piano. And I don't know if any of you ever knew Lynn, but he was a piano player. He actually wrote one of my favorite songs, a ballad called Sweetwater, which is about falling in love with Wyoming's spectacular Wind River Mountains. It was also nominated as a finalist in a contest to choose Wyoming's state song. But at the last moment, another song was selected called We Are Wyoming. This was more of a cute jingle than serious music. I'm convinced it won because a state legislator wrote it. It has mostly been forgotten. In later years, Lynn would become the associate clergy in Jackson, and he moonlighted by playing gigs in Jackson's famed War Hotel. The other COM member was Tom Satterfield, longtime Episcopalian, and an active member at St. James's Church in Riverton. He also served as a Fremont County Commissioner. He was at the time a rare breed of politician who was versed in classical music, religious knowledge, and a downright concern for people. Tom and Lynn and I were close friends, and we look forward to our journey to Wyoming. Lynn picked us up, and we journeyed east in his yellow Subaru station wagon. He spent the first part of the trip bragging about how he loved this vehicle and how well it performed in winter driving. Several miles outside of Rawlins, as we were ascending a place called Willow Hill, the Subaru just quit running. It came to a stop right there in the highway. We pushed the car off the road but couldn't get it started again. What to do? I volunteered to hitchhike into Rawlins and locate a tow truck. I would also call the diocese, this is before cell phones obviously, and let them know we would be late for the meeting. I was easily able to hitch a ride, and the friendly driver took me to a combination service station and diner. A Middle Eastern family ran the place, and they had a tow truck. The owner took me back to Lynn's Subaru, towed us back to his station, and said he would figure out what was wrong. While we waited, we decided to get breakfast and took our time so that he could better evaluate the situation. And we were surprised to come back to the garage and find Lynn's Subaru literally in pieces. He had taken it apart, but still couldn't find a problem. I went to plan B. I called the diocese from the payphone to explain our situation. Bishop Jones, that's Bishop Bob Jones, who was bishop then at the time, said he'd get the airplane fired up and fly to Rawlins to pick us up. For those of you who know Bishop Jones, he liked his airplane. Then he got back to us saying it was too cold for the plane. On to plan C. We would rent a car and drive, but there are no rentals available in Rawlins. And in the midst of our frustration, the garage owner came to me and said, "Why don't you take my car?" He said that it was full of gas and ready to go. He even refused our offer to pay him. A genuine act of kindness. And so, with suitcases in hand, we piled into what turned out to be a very expensive new Mercedes-Benz.
Oh my God.
And off we went. I carefully drove the vehicle onto I-80 and pushed the speed limit all the way while praying we didn't get stopped. We pulled into the cathedral parking lot soon after the meeting started. With great relief, we gave thanks for God's little miracle and for getting us to Laramie in style. But wait, there's more. After the meeting, we drove to our motel for the night, and we decided to check out the trunk. What a surprise. There sat a loaded rifle with several packages of a white powdery substance. The thought crossed our minds that we just smuggled a Middle Eastern cocaine shipment across the state, and someone would soon be coming to pick it up. Then we more closely examined the white stuff, and it said baby powder. Clever disguise, I thought. After cutting open the package to check, we were convinced it was indeed baby powder.
Wow.
At the conclusion of our gathering, Lynn found out his trusty vehicle had again been towed to the nearest Subaru dealer, which happened to be in Saratoga. So on our return, we detoured into the Platte River Valley town and found Lynn's car repaired and ready to go. It seems the timing belt had prematurely broken. The good news was that Subaru agreed to cover the cost of the repair, and the only loss was our time and inconvenience. The mechanic also discovered that this was Lynn Wright's car and asked if he could obtain one of Lynn's musical tapes. It was very popular back in the 80s. It seems he was a fan. Lynn was so happy about the turn of events, he gave him the tape for free. Then we headed back to Rawlins to return the Mercedes-Benz. As it turns out, the garage owner and his family were from Afghanistan and were truly some of the nicest people you could meet while traveling Wyoming's roads. We paid them for the initial towing and service costs, but they continued to refuse any payment for the use of their car. They were ironically the truest of good Samaritans. And I learned firsthand that lemons, in this case a faulty yellow Subaru, can be turned into lemonade. A wonderful gesture by a Middle Eastern immigrant. So that's a little bit of a story from the Trinity days, the Lander days, many more. And then, of course, covering the Wind River Reservation is a cultural shock if you're not prepared for it. Because it's all different on the Riz, as we like to call it. And I took that job with the understanding that I would not be in charge. I would do come on Sunday and do the services. And that somehow, in some way, they could pay me what they could, which would make up that full salary. But I learned, in a sense, I had to learn really quick about native customs and traditions because I didn't want to look like a knowledgeable white person. And so I found a mentor whose name is George Tinker, who teaches at Iowa School of Theology, and he was wonderful. And he told me more than I'd ever want to know. But at the same time, I had to experience it for myself. And a lot of people, I know even here, don't know a lot about the reservation. It's a fascinating, colorful place with unique people, with a unique sense of humor, who have been sort of forgotten by the rest of the state. And when you're close to there, like being in Lander or Riverton, usually abused or discriminated against. And one of the things that I ended up doing were funerals. One thing you do on the res is a lot of funerals. In fact, the Episcopal Church did most all the funerals on the reservation, both the Arapaho and the Shoshone side. And so I had to learn about funerals. And I discovered in doing that a wonderful occasion, and I'll read this to describe it. And most of you probably don't know this, but some of you may. Most burials first require a day for the wake to honor the departed, and a day-long liturgical funeral service that includes a graveside ceremony followed by a feast. It is customary for the priest to attend all of these events. The wake involves the deceased body to lie in state, usually inside the church's door with the casket being open. Sometimes it is held at the home of a relative. Family members and others remain with the body day and night until the start of the service. And they truly do gather around, both in prayer and just in story time. Honoring a body is important in Native American culture. Cremation is a rarity. The wake is a time for prayers and last remembrances. The funeral itself is usually standing room only affair. Occasionally it's done in a teepee, but mostly it takes place at St. David's Church building. The service rarely starts on time. Instead, it begins when everyone arrives. By the way, that's the definition out there of Indian time. Everybody gets there, you're ready to start. Everybody's ready to go home, it's over. That's Indian time. I would lead the service as the officiate, but often there are musicians or a ceremonial drum group. My sermons usually included a few things about life, death, and the fact that the soul of the departed is going back to the Creator from where it came. Those in attendance can best be described as respectful. At the service's completion, everyone proceeds to the graveside. This usually means the Sacagawea Cemetery down the road from the mission in Fort Washington. This is the cemetery that certainly the people on the reservation believe that Sacagawea of Lewis and Clark is buried there. Even more people show up for this occasion. The casket remains open for viewing, and the body is carefully dressed and wrapped in an expensive and colorful Pendleton blanket. Before the committal, time is spent taking one last look at the deceased and then greeting the family. I would take my place in the greeting like everyone else. This is an opportunity for true grieving. Many cry, wail, and truly say goodbye to the deceased. Loved ones get their emotions out. At an appropriate time, the burial begins. Final prayers of committal are said, and often an elder will add prayers in the Shoshone language. The body is lowered into the grave, often to the accompaniment of the dead person's possessions, including suitcases full of clothing and other personal items. I find this to be the most powerful part of the service, especially when the drum ceremony is included. The drums are beaten at a high crescendo, and the coffin is lowered into the ground, and then the drumming suddenly stops. There's an eerie silence, and it's over. The people grab nearby shovels and begin to fill the grave with dirt. The graveside service allows participants the chance to grieve and express their emotional feelings. This is in contrast to the standard white, meaning us, graveside service, where grieving is often suppressed and real dirt has been taken away and hard to find. Once the grave is filled, there is a traditional giveaway. Gifts are presented by family members to those in attendance. These tend to be practical kinds of gifts that can be readily used, such as gloves or battery cables. Those attending are honored as well as the deceased. Then it's back to the parish hall or another suitable location for the concluding feast. The funeral includes a time for the expression of sadness, grieving, and saying goodbye. The feast is not just for celebrating the dead person's life, but also provides people an opportunity to move on with their own life as well. Resident Episcopal priests on the reservation would make the funeral a 3-day commitment. Sadly, I was not able to do that. However, I became fully engaged in every burial occasion. So that gives you a little feel for, and one last story, part of that. One of my favorite reservation associates was the Shoshone elder. His name was Harrison Shoyo. Harrison was one of the tribe's wisest people. He would most always be asked to deliver the Shoshone prayer at the graveside. These prayers would go on for quite a while. I never understood what he was saying in the Shoshone language. I would recognize the names of Jesus Christ and Father Murphy, and trust he was saying good things about both of us. His style was never preachy or sanctimonious, yet hearing Harrison say that prayer conveyed within me a powerful presence. This was the case even after he finished spiritual prayer by saying, "Anyone here got a cigarette?" There was no pretense in the native service. So we spent 7 years there in Lander, 5 of those covering the Wind River Reservation. Many stories about that are in the book. But at the end, it came time to, we've now spent 12 years in Wyoming. We were growing very comfortable with the state and with its people. And I kept thinking, as Kate did, maybe still want to move on at some point, not stay here too much longer. And the opportunity came to when Cody opened up, when Pat Keller and Connie decided to retire and move to Washington. And I remember seeing his little letter in the newsletter here saying they were leaving and that the church was looking for a new rector. Kate and I said, well, I've always sort of thought Cody's a great place. Why not apply there? And to make a long story short, the initial search did not work out very well. And I think, Douglas, you were on the search committee. Anybody else on that original search committee? Laurie was on it?
And Jim.
So you know the story. It was rushed. And the applicants, and there were several of us, all from Wyoming, felt it was rushed. We kept looking at, as I put it in the book, when they had the interviews in Mary's office, we were all sitting there and we look at Pat Keller's desk. He left his desk behind. They kept thinking, there's his desk and chair. He's barely going. They're trying to fill it already. It's not going to work. We talked amongst ourselves and said, no, it's not going to work. And we all decided to drop out. At which point they did what they probably should have done, which was consult with the bishop more closely and find a consultant to do a real search process. And we went through that process, and then several months, I guess maybe it's close to a year, I can't remember how much, but they decided to do it. And so they looked for a new rector. I applied, Kate and I. And then one day they sent 2 people down to check us out. One of them sitting right there, Jim Hager, and the other was Bill Garlow. 2 of the finest, best dressed businessmen you're going to find in the church. And of course they showed up one Sunday morning at Trinity, where I was doing the service. Everybody looked at them, they knew they were visitors. Because nobody didn't get the memo that they don't wear suits and ties there. Pretty casual. But they were there, and it was very polite, and they talked to people, and they realized we were applying. And these guys were so nice and so gracious that I actually asked Jim if, when I went out to do the service on the reservation, would he mind coming and playing the organ, because everybody else did. And we had a great time doing that.
That's wonderful.
Jim to this day just likes that event. But as the story goes now, we ended up being selected and came to Cody. And that takes me to volume 2. I'll do a couple stories out of that. I'll let you go and ask some questions. One is a cute little story is our first arrival here. And so many of you will know these positions, places, etc. I look forward to learning more about Cody's history, and in particular the role that Buffalo Bill Cody played in developing his namesake town. My first lesson came one day too. We were invited to a welcome breakfast at the home of a parishioner who lived on Rumsey Street on the other side of town. I'd already, by the way, said we were living in the rectory, which is right over here at the time. I knew I could remember that street because my former bishop, Harold Robinson in Buffalo, New York, had a home on Rumsey Street in that city. And I later learned that both Rumsey Streets were named after the same man. Buffalo and Cody. Bronson Rumsey was one of Buffalo Bill's closest associates, and he was born in Buffalo. No, he's from Buffalo, New York. In fact, several of Cody's streets were named after William Cody's business associates, including the street we lived on called Garens Avenue. It was named after Henry Garens, whose relatives were real estate agents known to me while living in Buffalo. I always wondered if that is why Buffalo's pro football team is called the Buffalo Bills. And indeed, it's a small world. Christ Church grounds are truly impressive. I talk about the main church building, this one, constructed in 1965 on land donated by the Simpson family of Cody. Yes, this is the same family of Senator Al Simpson. And I knew the Simpsons were longtime members of the congregation. The original building was constructed downtown near the Park County Courthouse in 1902. And then I described that, and it's called the Little Church, or as some know it as the Poker Church. And I tell that story where there was a serious poker game at Purcell's Saloon. Buffalo Bill and several of his buddies were involved, and one hand apparently grew quite large. It was felt there might be some bad feelings in the end, so it was agreed by all that the winner of the hand would not keep the money, but donate it for the construction of Cody's first church building. George Beck, another one of Buffalo Bill's business partners, won the pot and handed it over to his wife, Daisy. She then used it to start the building fund for the original Christ Episcopal Church. The Poker Church name seemed to stick, and today it's a top Cody tourist attraction. I think most of you probably know that story in one way or another, but it's a fun one to tell about. And it is connected to Buffalo, New York. That's, by the way, not only did I have that as my first diocese, but I got there coming as a Vista volunteer back in the late 60s to deal with the low-income issues of Buffalo in that area. and then stayed on in that diocese. And then one other story that while I wasn't here, Cody, Kate loves this story because it's about her. And this is sort of classic here, but I was part of a summer continuing ed program. It's part of a sabbatical. And I went to Virginia Theological Seminary for this to learn how to renew your congregation. It was a 6-week program in April. And so I decided to do that as part of my sabbatical. It'd be a great chance to go back to Virginia where I'd spent some time. And we had a great program. It was a lot of intensive learning. We lived on the third floor of their continuing education building, which unfortunately when we got there they told us the one problem up there is the hot weather. It takes forever to get there. So most of your showers will be cold. We can live with that. Anyway, the course went along quite well, and one part of it was a sabbatical. As a part of the sabbatical was a program for the spouses to come from wherever they were around the country and spend a few days, a long weekend, with their other half to learn about the program we were doing and have some fun time. Kate's already got a look on her face. I've got to tell you this look. She was already angry because I'd left in the middle of winter at sea in April in Wyoming and was telling her about the beautiful flowers coming out of Virginia and how wonderful it was. Anyway, here it goes. One part of this program that didn't turn out so well was the planned weekend for spouse visitation. I look forward to Kate's visit, the weekend together, as were the other course participants. I could tell by our phone calls that she was a bit exasperated by my balmy Virginia time while she struggled through the continued Wyoming winter. I rented a car for the weekend so we could travel around locally. Her United Airlines flight to Washington via Chicago was scheduled to arrive on Friday afternoon. When arriving at the airport, I discovered her plane was indefinitely delayed in Chicago.
Oh, gosh.
It didn't arrive until evening, and upon arrival, Kate was fighting back a bad mood. It seems everyone was seated on her morning flight and ready for the scheduled Chicago departure, but there were no pilots. This stressful situation was compounded when we discovered upon her arrival that her luggage didn't arrive either. We made the best of it, and on our arrival at the seminary, she pleaded for a hot shower to wipe away the travel in a way to settle things down. But alas, no water on the top floor. I could see this spouse weekend was not off to a good start. Next morning, I figured some hot coffee and a tasty breakfast in the refectory, that's what they call the dining room there, we'd get the day off to a better start. We found ourselves seated next to 2 students and began a perfunctory conversation. Kate noticed that one student was drinking coffee from a cup and blazoned with the words, "Piss me off, pay the consequences." And she said to him in a determined voice, "I have to have that cup." I actually have a picture of it here. We still have it on our show. It expressed her feelings at that particular moment. The student read her face and said, "Absolutely, ma'am," and turned it over. After they left, I noticed a well-dressed, white-haired man heading in our direction. He asked if he could join us. I recognized who he was and said, "Certainly." He was Peter Lee, the Bishop of Virginia, and head of the seminary board. He often stayed over at the seminary when he was in the vicinity. He welcomed us as part of the continuing education program and asked how we liked our stay. Kate, not knowing him from anyone else in the world, let out her frustrations about her trip and expressed her displeasure about not having a hot shower. I explained to our guest that apparently no one has been able to get hot water up on that top floor. Bishop Lee was very kind, and after a nice conversation about the seminary, wished us well for the remainder of the weekend. I felt bad about the exchange, but lo and behold, the next day, hot water returned to the top floor. I told my story to Burton Newman, who ran the program, and he was impressed. Kate managed to accomplish something no one else was able to do. I'd never heard the end of this experience. The piss me off, pay the consequences cup is the most used in our household. Thankfully, we got through that spouse weekend, and it was great to have Kate there. She was relieved to get both hot water and her clothes back from the airline. But then her aggravations picked up all over again when she found out we were headed off to our silent retreat while the spouses were left behind to negotiate their own way out of town. Kate remembers well her departure as she left for the airport in our rented car. She turned on the radio, stepped on the gas, and as she peeled out of the parking area, the tune playing on the radio was The Animals. We've got to get out of this place if it's the last thing we ever do. Does that sound right?
You just put down.
Play the ground. Anyway, the time here as a rector was a great experience. And I point out in the book, it's when it came time for us to leave, that I was really impressed that Mary was going to be my replacement, because I knew Mary. I had nothing to do with hiring her. But I knew that she would carry on the stuff that we've been doing for 15 years, and she has truly done that. And then I went on to run this Wyoming Association of Churches, which I had been involved with, going under different names, Council of Churches, Association of Churches. And we were involved in all kinds of Wyoming events, including leading the effort to prevent casino gambling to come to Wyoming. We put that ballot initiative out there and won it. Using life parole instead of the death sentence, and that had passed the legislature. We did a lot of things that were very meaningful. The most recent was the effort we spent years working on getting the legislature to remove the sales tax on groceries. So there's a lot of things, and I explain all that in the book, but that was a wonderful occasion to deal with the entire state of Wyoming. And I did that for 5 years, and then I moved on to a thing called Not Retired, which I'm doing presently, because I truly believe that when you're called to ministry, you're called forever. And you may not be working on a specific job, but you're working in the ministry. And I want to finish, well, first of all, before I do the last story, any questions you've all got, or thoughts, or anything you'd like to hear about in any of those locations? I have such a speechless Episcopal group here. I don't understand this. Any questions at all? Any thoughts? Yes, go ahead.
What are your thoughts about the current divisive environment where people seem to be so polarized in the community and in the state? In your experience, have you been through a similar period? Do you think this is unique? What are your thoughts?
You heard that question? That because of all the divisiveness we're having now, is that something I've seen in the past, or is it unique to now? Frankly, to tell you, my experience, and you've had your own experiences, in my experience, no. People, when I first came to Wyoming, there was a motto, live and let live. And you could be a little bit different from everybody else, and you could have your own ideas, and that's okay as long as you don't mess with somebody else's ideas. Very libertarian sense. And parties, there were 2 parties then, by the way. There's only one now. There were 2 parties in those days. There was a Democratic and a Republican Party. And they were pretty much equal. Most of our governors have been Democrats. And although people would disagree and have disagreements and argue over it, and Al Simpson can tell the story, you probably heard better than I could ever tell. People still understood and cared about each other and didn't make it personal. And they got to know each other and to really work with each other, even though they may disagree on an issue. And I think that was the tradition that I had was going on here when I arrived. And it was that way most of the time. And I think it's only recently that all of this sort of nastiness has begun to come out. But that's my own view and observation of it. I'm going to preach on that here Sunday, by the way. That's the topic I'm dealing with. And I know you all have your own ideas about that. But it is a different day. And it's sad to see Wyoming begin to tilt a little bit toward the rest of the country in doing that. Because we have been unique and different in that we do allow each other to say what they want to and be able to live as a community within them. And in 2001, on the 100th anniversary of this parish, we did a wonderful anniversary celebration that many of you were part of. For the 100th anniversary. And it wasn't just, look how great it is and what good food we've had and all that kind of stuff. We spent 3 days dealing with issues about the state of Wyoming and about how we need to be a community. And we brought in all kinds of neat speakers. Pete Simpson was the one who arranged most of our speakers. Brought him from the University of Montana, brought him from Wyoming, and talked about the nature of being a community. I write about that in the book, by the way, a very powerful chapter because it reminds us that that's what we should be doing. And our guest speaker at the time, our keynote speaker, was one of Al's friends, Senator Mark Hatfield of Oregon. And he was wonderful. I'll never forget a little party we had afterwards up at Al and Ann's cabin up on the South Fork. And everybody who was involved all came together. Bishop Caldwell was here. He preached his service for that Sunday. Everybody who was involved all came up to that cabin, sitting around a fire and talking about how wonderful it is we can all get together and do this kind of thing in Wyoming. And to me, that was one of the highlights of being the director here. So that's just my answer to your question. Any others? What time is it? Anybody know?
It's 20:07. I'm
That's good. One of the things, by the way, you notice is Episcopal churches never have clocks because we're on God's time. So technically you should never look at the clock. Except when you're doing
because they
sermon.
don't work.
And Kate knows this because she has a little thing she does. I'll share it with you. You know, when I'm doing a sermon, I don't know if Casey does it with you, but if it goes over 7 minutes, she starts doing this. This. So it means close it. But we don't have clocks in Episcopal churches, and I think that's wonderful. But a lot of times people have asked me, how did you get started in all of this? How did you want to be in the ministry? When did you want to be an Episcopal priest? All those questions. I think we all have to start our spiritual journey somewhere. And I have a story about that here. It's in the latter part, actually, of this book, the second volume. As I saved it toward the end. And I had a number of flashbacks here into the past, not just Wyoming. But it's from a chapter called A Holy Calling, because I feel my calling was indeed holy, as should every priest. And so, set the scene here. When I was in college in Virginia, I had a summer job selling dictionaries from door to door. Terrible job. At least everybody said it was a terrible job. Nobody wants to sell dictionaries.
Working for them is difficult.
Yeah.
And
But at the same time, I figured, if I can do a summer job like that, there's nothing in the world that I can't do. And so I made it an adventure, one of my first life adventures, to do that job. Learn how to do it, sell it, whatever. Sell these little dictionaries. And they were good books. It was a pyramid scheme thing, but college students did it. And it was a good book. It was an encyclopedic dictionary. And it had color pictures of all the presidents at the time. It was really a classy book to sell, easy sell. And we were sent off to the south. My territory was western Tennessee and a little chunk of northern Mississippi. Not in New Jersey. This was 1966. In the midst of all the civil rights turmoil. I had a New Jersey tag on my car, in fact. So things could be a little rough. People looked at you a little strange in those days, but nonetheless, I thought this is a job I can do. And we were told to go out and go to every house you see to sell that book. Poor or rich or whoever, go sell it. And so I did that. And I started off terrible. I was going to quit at one point. I said, no, I can't quit. Because I don't know what to do if I quit. I'd be a loser. My life would be a loser. And I had to do it. And so I really stuck with it. And I actually, toward the latter part of the summer, became very good at it. Scary. I was actually selling these things. I shouldn't have been buying them in many cases. But I was able to convince them. But I also had to deal with some of the poorest people in that territory, in Mississippi and Tennessee. And I would go to a lot of these very poor houses, and I feel bad almost trying to sell them, but yet I knew that when poor people looked at that dictionary, they weren't looking at it as a thing to buy. They were looking at it as education for their kids and for them. Because all the education was in that encyclopedic dictionary. It was $10 back in the day. And so a lot of times I even cut some deals with some very poor people just because I knew they wanted that book. So anyway, one day, I'm just doing this as a college student, trying to see and have a life experience. And I'd always wondered about, and I'd been involved a little bit with the Canterbury Club in Virginia. I knew religion a little bit, but didn't take it all that serious until this happened. I think I maybe told this story before, but so we're finishing with I talk about this summer trip, and I say it was during this time that I received my call from God. It happened one day while making a sales visit to a poor sharecropper family. And I don't know if you know what a sharecropper is, but it's somebody who actually has to grow their own crops and they're allowed a certain piece of ground. That's how they make their money, by selling what they can, rather than get a real salary. Their home was a tiny shack, and upon knocking at the door, I was greeted by a young mother and 2 small children. I noticed they were having lunch, which consisted of candy, bars, and soda pop. They paid close attention as I did my sales pitch. I showed them the beginning of the book that included a color photo of the martyred President John Kennedy. I saw they were fascinated by this book of knowledge and eagerly desired to have it. The young mother wanted to buy it, but first she needed to speak to her husband, who was in the nearby field working his share of the land. Visiting with a husband is the last thing a salesman wants to hear after making his pitch, because usually they say, we don't need it. I looked out in the field as she called him and noticed the most muscular black man I had ever seen. He was pushing his plow by hand, and sweat was pouring off his body. She called him over and told him about this book. As he turned over the pages, I could see what this meant for him and for his children. We made brief eye contact. And for that brief moment, I looked into the eyes not of just a poor black man, but into the very eyes of Jesus. The silent words coming from that gaze said to me that the only reason this wonderful man was poor was because he was born black. I was told by this silent voice that injustice was the cause of this dilemma. In Jesus' world, this must never be the case. It was then this holy farmer, as I called him, spoke, saying he wanted this book more than anything, but he simply didn't have enough money. I offered him a big discount and said, the book is yours. As I handed it over, I said to myself a little prayer that this would bring positive change to their lives. I knew it would mine. that time on, I committed myself to carrying out Jesus' ministry by combating racism whenever I can. Justice that day became my calling in life, and that summer of selling dictionaries enabled my call to the Christian ministry. And so I leave you with that story because that's where it all begins. I do have some books out here that if you would like, you can buy them separately. They come as a set, volume 1 and 2, as you see. But if you want just one, Wally Johnson said he only wanted the one that had his name in it. I think I'll change his mind. But nonetheless, most people get them in the sets because it is a whole story. And I would have those, I'll be glad to sign them, and we can even do credit cards, or if you'd like, just cash is fine as well. So that's the conclusion.
I have somebody who is on Facebook who wants to know if they don't live here in Cody and they're not here tonight, how can they get the book?
Great question, because we have, thanks to Malcolm, one of the top websites in the state of Wyoming. And it's really true. It's called uniqueanddifferent.info. And just do that, uniqueanddifferent.info, and you can buy them on PayPal, there's credit cards, you can learn about the books. And you can also get, I think, my first book there as well, and soon. And we will mail them out with personal